There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over certain people in the middle of a crowded room. Not sadness, exactly. Not loneliness in the way most people describe it. It's something more specific than that. A kind of internal stillness that stands in contrast to everything happening around you. The noise feels louder than it should be. The pace feels faster than it needs to be. And somewhere beneath all of it, there's this low, persistent awareness that you're slightly out of phase with the world you're standing in. Not broken, not bitter, just somewhere between two frequencies that never quite aligned. If you were born somewhere between the mid-70s and the mid-80s, there's a real possibility that feeling has been with you for a long time. Not as crisis, not as dysfunction, just as a kind of background hum that follows you from decade to decade, job to job, social situation to social situation. The sensation that you don't fully belong to the past you grew up in, and you don't fully belong to the present you're living in either. This video isn't going to tell you what to do about that. It's going to do something that might feel more unusual. It's going to sit with you in that hum for a little while and explain why it's there. People like you didn't arrive at psychological complexity through a single dramatic event. You arrived through years of quiet accumulation, of adapting, recalibrating, holding things together without being asked to hold things together, simply because that's what the environment required. You grew up in a world that didn't protect childhood with the same intentionality that's expected today. Not because your parents or caregivers didn't love you, but because the culture itself operated differently. Feelings were private, resilience was assumed. Children were expected to find their own way through confusion, boredom, and emotional discomfort without a great deal of scaffolding. And most of you did exactly that. You learned to read rooms before you had language for what room reading was. You learned to regulate your own nervous system before anyone explained what a nervous system was. You learned to sit with uncertainty without naming it, because naming it wasn't really an option. If this feels familiar, that quiet competence, that deep self-sufficiency, that lifelong sense of being slightly older than your actual age, then this is for you. Not to celebrate that, not to frame it as a gift, just to acknowledge it clearly. That's what happened to you, and it makes complete sense that it shaped who you became. There's a strange thing that happens when a generation falls between the categories that culture has decided to recognize. You're not Gen X in the way Gen X is usually described, that studied detachment, that early exposure to disillusionment, that particular brand of ironic distance from institutions. You were too young for most of that to fully land. And you're not a millennial in the way millennials are usually described, the digital natives, the participation trophy narrative, the growing up with the internet as a constant companion. You encountered the internet as young adults, not as children. You had a before and an after that millennials largely didn't have in the same way. What you had instead was this: a childhood formed entirely in analog reality, and an adulthood that required you to rebuild your entire operating system mid-life. Think about what that actually meant neurologically. Your formative years, the years when your nervous system was building its core models of how the world works, what safety feels like, how communication happens, what connection looks like. All of that happened in a world without smartphones, without social media, without the constant availability of digital stimulation or digital validation. Then, somewhere in your late 20s or early 30s, the world fundamentally changed, and you were expected to change with it, seamlessly, without acknowledgement that anything significant had shifted. You adapted. Of course you did. But adaptation isn't the same as natural fit, and your nervous system never forgot what it was originally wired for. Here's something that clinical psychology understands, even if culture rarely discusses it plainly. The nervous system doesn't just process experiences, it builds predictions from them. From the time you were young, your nervous system was quietly cataloging what the world was like. It was learning the rhythm of a slower information environment. It was learning that boredom was something you moved through, not something you immediately escaped. It was learning to tolerate ambiguity without reaching for a screen. It was learning that social interaction happened in real time, with all the complexity and awkwardness and genuine presence that required. These weren't lessons you were taught, they were experiences your nervous system encoded as baseline normal. And a nervous system that was built on that baseline doesn't simply override it when the environment shifts. It carries both versions simultaneously, the original wiring and the adaptive layer built on top of it. What that creates, in practice, is a person who functions in the modern world but is never fully at ease in it. Someone who can participate, but who comes home afterward and needs to decompress from the sheer volume of input in a way that people who grew up immersed in that input might not understand. You weren't broken. You were built for a world that stopped existing. And the weight of carrying those two operating systems in parallel, the original and the adaptive, that's exhausting in a way that's difficult to explain to people who never experienced the transition. There are things you're genuinely good at because of how you were shaped. Patience in situations where others lose it, the ability to sit with discomfort without immediately needing it to resolve, a certain groundedness that comes from having built your sense of self before external validation was a constant variable. But every adaptation has a shadow side, and honesty requires acknowledging that. The same self-sufficiency that made you capable made it harder to ask for help, not because you're proud, though sometimes that's part of it, but because somewhere in your developmental history, needing help and receiving it reliably weren't consistently paired. So your nervous system learned to treat need as something to manage internally, rather than something to extend outward. That's not a character flaw. That's a learned strategy, one that served you and one that also cost you. The same capacity to contain your emotional world, to process quietly, to not burden other people, to maintain composure in situations that genuinely warranted falling apart, that capacity is real and it's valuable. But containment isn't the same as resolution. And years of containing things that deserved more space, more acknowledgement, more actual processing, those things don't disappear. They settle into the body and the nervous system as a kind of ambient weight. You probably know the feeling, that background tiredness that isn't really about sleep, that vague sense that you've been holding something for a very long time and you're not entirely sure what it is or when you can set it down. That's not weakness. That's the accumulated cost of a particular kind of strength. There's a specific quality to contemporary culture that people in your age range often struggle to articulate without sounding like they're simply complaining about change. It's not that change is the problem. You've navigated enormous change. The issue is something more precise than that. Modern life, particularly the social and digital architecture of it, is built around an underlying assumption that visibility equals validity, that the way to establish connection is through performance, that the appropriate response to any experience is to immediately translate it into shareable content, that attention is currency, and that human worth is measured in some meaningful way by the volume of that attention. Your nervous system was built before that framework existed, and something in you, not the complaining part, not the resistant part, but the quiet, deep part, recognizes that framework as fundamentally hollow. Not because you're superior to it, not because you've figured something out that others haven't, but because you have an embodied memory of what interaction felt like before it was mediated that way. You know what it is to be bored without it being a crisis. You know what it is to have a feeling without an audience for it. You know what it is to simply exist in a moment without documenting it, because that was just Tuesday. And when the entire social environment is structured around the opposite of that, around constant output, constant performance, constant calibration to external response, it creates a kind of friction that isn't philosophical, it's neurological. Your system was tuned to one frequency, the world is broadcasting on another. That's not resistance, that's not failure to adapt. That's environmental mismatch, and it's a real phenomenon. And it explains a great deal about why modern social life often feels like wearing clothes that almost fit but don't quite. What doesn't get said often enough is how much cognitive and emotional labor it takes to live fluently in a world your nervous system didn't anticipate. You do it every day. Most of you do it without fanfare. You participate in digital culture. You navigate workplace dynamics that have shifted dramatically in their expectations and rhythms. You maintain relationships across generations, some people older than you who remember a world before all of this, and some people younger who genuinely cannot conceive of the world you grew up in as normal. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, you are the translator, the bridge, the person who understands both enough to function in both, but belongs completely to neither. That position is quietly exhausting, not dramatically, not in a way that produces crisis, just in a way that means the baseline level of effort required to exist in this world is slightly higher for you than for people who grew up entirely within it. And the cultural conversation doesn't really have a category for that. Gen X has its identity, millennials have their identity. But the people in between, the ones who grew up analog and came of age in the transition, exist in a kind of cultural blind spot. No one makes content specifically for your experience. No one names your particular flavor of navigating this world. And for people who spent much of their childhood learning to find their own way through things without a map, that absence is familiar. It doesn't produce collapse. It just produces that quiet, persistent sense of existing slightly outside the frame. You weren't broken by that. You were shaped by it. This isn't the part of the video where everything gets resolved, because it doesn't, not cleanly, and anything that told you it did would be lying to you. But there is something worth sitting with here, not as instruction, not as a path to fixing what was never broken, but as permission. The version of you that was built in an analog world, in a slower information environment, with a nervous system calibrated to presence and patience and quiet, that version of you is not a relic. It's not outdated. It's not something to be overcome or upgraded. It's the deepest layer of who you are. And it's also, in ways that are quietly significant, one of the things that makes you genuinely capable of depth in a world that rewards surface. The wiring that makes modern life feel loud is the same wiring that allows you to stay in a difficult conversation long enough for it to actually go somewhere. The wiring that makes constant performance feel hollow is the same wiring that makes genuine connection, when you find it, feel like something real rather than something staged. The wiring that makes digital validation feel insufficient is the same wiring that means your sense of self, however quietly maintained, was built from the inside out rather than the outside in. That's not nothing. In a cultural moment defined by fragility of identity and dependence on external mirrors, a person who knows how to exist without constant external confirmation is carrying something genuinely rare. You don't need to perform that. You don't need to monetize it or broadcast it or turn it into content. But you might benefit from simply recognizing it, acknowledging that the adaptations you built, the ways your nervous system learned to navigate the world, were responses to real conditions. Smart responses. Costly responses, yes, but not signs of damage. What integration looks like isn't a new you, it's a clearer relationship with the one that already exists. It's permission to stop apologizing internally or externally for the way you're wired. Permission to stop treating your need for slowness, your preference for depth, your discomfort with performance as deficits to be managed. They are not deficits. They are the shape of you. If you've stayed with this video to the end, it probably means something in it recognized you, not as a type,
not as a demographic, but as a specific kind of person who has been navigating a specific kind of quiet displacement for most of their adult life. That displacement is real. The wiring behind it is real. And the tiredness that comes from carrying an original operating system through a world that was rebuilt around a different one, that's real too. Nothing about it means you failed to adapt. You adapted extraordinarily well. The cost of that adaptation is also real and worth acknowledging, not to produce grief about it, but simply because things that are true deserve to be named. You weren't broken. You were built for a world that changed faster than nervous systems are designed to change. And the person that emerged from that, thoughtful, self-sufficient, quietly deep, a little out of phase, that person makes complete sense. If something in this landed for you, I'd be glad to hear what it was. Not because engagement matters to an algorithm, though it does, but because the comments on videos like this tend to become something more than comments. They become a quiet record of people recognizing themselves in language that usually passes them by. If you want to be here when the next one comes out, you know where the button is. But more than that, just know that this space, if nothing else, is somewhere built for the frequency you're already on.